I think the first ever YouTube video I ever posted was an interview with you.
Uh-huh.
Uh, I,
Yeah.
I think it must have been about 2010. And I think back then we were there weren't many people back then working on like Stoicism and CBT.
No, there wasn't really a lot going on. I mean, so yeah, it's amazing how much it's changed now. Like it's a huge thing now. Like yeah, there wasn't really anything happening back then.
There wasn't much at all. There was no Stoic meetups. There was no kind of Stoic conferences. Very little Stoic online group or anything like.
Uh,
So, I mean, obviously, it's grown a huge amount in that time in the
yeah,
last 8 to 10 years. Do you have
yeah.
a sense of how much it's grown? I mean, is that something you can track? Are there metrics for that?
I guess
For
there's a
this?
couple of things like we could look at. So we can see the Facebook group. I guess it probably started around the same time, and it's got 46,000 members now. The Stoicism face group that I run. And then I
Mm,
suppose it wasn't long after that we did the first Stoic week, and I think it was small. One of the first ones. I'm not sure if it was the first one or the second one. Had 700 people doing
mhm.
Stoic week online, and the last time we ran it, I think it had 8,000.
Wow.
Like so, like
Yeah.
as an indication, it just grows slightly bigger every year.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, being in Toronto, I've got a feeling that Toronto might be the city that has the largest number of people that are interested in Stoicism as well. So I feel like I'm kind of in a place where there's a particular buzz around it. Oh, I know one other metric is there's all those local meetup groups,
Yeah.
uh, and a lot of them are connected to the Stoic Fellowship, and they're dotted all over the world. But the one in Toronto has over 1,000 members, believe it or
Yes.
not,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's which is by far the largest. So that's
What is
another
what's the
metric.
Stoic Fellowship?
It's an organisation that encourages people to set up local meetup groups and
Right.
discuss Stoicism and stuff.
Is that part of modern Stoicism, of the modern Stoicism group?
No, it's not actually. Like it's a separate thing, although it's something that I think we could probably do more to connect with. There's quite a lot of a connection there, a little bit of an overlap. But it's a
Yeah.
separate organisation.
And so, why do you think it has grown so much, Stoicism, in the last decade?
Well, there's a bunch of reasons. So I think, I mean, some of it has got to do that we can take credit for maybe from all the stuff that modern Stoicism does. I guess we have to say like, well, Stoic Week and the conferences and the Stoicism Today blog, which has over 500 articles in it now. So all the stuff that modern Stoicism does must have contributed to some extent.
Yeah.
And also, there's just all the books coming out. I mean, is that chicken or egg? Are there more books on Stoicism because there's a demand for it, or is
Mm.
the demand being fueled by the books coming out? Well, the past 10 years or so, there have been a lot of books by different people, and in particular, I think Bill Irving's book and Ryan Holiday's books, and also Tim Ferriss has
Yeah.
introduced a lot of people to Stoicism just by, he's brought out an audiobook version of Seneca's letters or something like that, I think.
Yeah.
And there's
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah. And what, I mean, do you think also that there are kind of cultural reasons as well?
Yeah. So the cultural reasons, I believe. No, I mean, actually, I'm in the fortunate position of just being able to kind of echo back stuff that people have said to me. So the things I hear over and over again from people are, first of all, because of the growth of evidence-based practice in psychotherapy and CBT, that kind of legitimizes a lot of the ancient Stoic ideas, and so the growth of popularity in CBT has helped to fuel culturally the interest in Stoicism. It's given it more validity. And also, a lot of people say they see Stoicism as a kind of Western alternative to Buddhism or other, Eastern traditions. So they're looking for something that's like Buddhism, but maybe more familiar, more Western. And the other thing is people see it as a kind of secular alternative to Christianity. So it gives them a philosophy of life and an ethic a bit like Christianity, but
Yeah.
rather than being based on faith or revelation or scripture or whatever, they see Stoicism as being more based in philosophical reasoning. And people want something that's like academic philosophy, they tell me, but that's more down to earth and more practical. And they see Stoicism as kind of filling that niche as well.
And do you think it's also, I mean, you look at when Stoicism first appeared at a time of political upheaval, and people shift their idea of the good life, you know, for Plato and Aristotle is very much attached to the kind of the good state. And the Stoics and Epicureans, there's this idea, how can we live a good life when we can't really trust or know what shape the state will be in? Do you think that it's that as well? That first of all, it just fits with the individualism of the time, but secondly, there's just a sense of, well, what do I have control over in such a, you know, a rapidly changing time?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely a lot of liberals that say that since Trump got elected, they feel they have to fall back on Stoicism as a way of dealing with the political situation in the States. You know, that's something people say a lot. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, like, I'm not sure, you know, why that's become a thing more recently than it would have been in the past. But I think people do feel that embracing Stoicism is a way of coping with a sense of disempowerment. And the frustration with like the political situation around the world. And I suppose the other thing is technology that we kind of haven't mentioned. There's an odd connection there whereby as we get more immersed in social media and stuff, and people feel that that's kind of taken over their lives, and you know, it's affecting the way that we think and interact and relate with other people. People seem to feel that Stoicism's emphasis on simplicity and, you know, self-discipline is a way of compensating for or dealing with the negative effects of our immersion in social media.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's something I hear a lot as well.
And I mean, as an idea or set of ideas takes off, no, I mean, no one's really in control of these ideas. You're probably the closest to the Stoic Pope at the moment. But even you don't have you know, you can't send out papal bulls or declare fast.
No.
So particularly with Stoicism, but just with Buddhism as well, or any philosophy in this, I mean, no one's in charge of them. So has it evolved in ways that surprised you over the last decade?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I'm really like surprised, but it's evolved in interesting ways. I wouldn't say they came as a big shock, but I mean, the thing I think you probably noticed this early on as well, that there are some people that are much more into the religious dimension of Stoicism, and one of the interesting things is they've kind of split off. You know, they seem to find it hard to integrate with it. And our data suggests that the majority of people that are interested in Stoicism are agnostics or atheists. Which is interesting because, you know, the ancient Stoics were very religious. You know, and particularly Epictetus talks a lot about Zeus and the importance of belief in him. But most of the people that embrace Stoicism today aren't very religious. And the ones that are seem to struggle to kind of integrate sometimes with the rest of the community. That's a kind of flashpoint or whatever. And
so what have they done? Have they retreated to, do they call themselves like...
traditional Stoicism is the term that some people use.
Is that what they call themselves, traditional Stoic? And there's that kind of, my old colleague, Eric Weigart from the Stoic Registry. Have you come across him?
Yeah, I've seen his stuff. I haven't heard so much from him.
He and I remember we organized a kind of a very early tiny gathering of Stoics, like 2011 or something, where he lives in San Diego. And there was only like 10 people, but there was still managed to be a schism between religious Stoics and then Stoics who hated religion.
Yeah,
almost kind of refugees from religion.
Yeah,
that was you know, there are only 10 people there. You know? It doesn't entirely surprise me. So there's traditional Stoicism, and they kind of have their own forums, their own organizations.
Yeah, there's a separate Facebook group, but we have a lot of people that are into religious aspects, theological aspects of Stoicism in our group as well. But there does seem to be like a little bit of friction there sometimes. And then the other one is people talk about like broicism is the term that people use to describe Also, people talk about Silicon Valley Stoicism as well. So there's a lot of people in the tech industry that get into Stoicism, and sometimes people feel that it's kind of like life coaching and personal development and self-improvement stuff, but it kind of lacks the emphasis on simplicity and austerity and stuff like that you get in ancient Stoicism. So like there's a bit of a divergence there, I guess. Some Stoicism's a bit more materialistic, but you can even see that Seneca was one of the wealthiest men in history, right? And then Epictetus was a freed slave that sounds like he lived in poverty. So even in the ancient world, it sounds like there was a bit of a split between Stoics who kind of renounced wealth and other ones that accumulated a lot of wealth but said that they weren't attached to it.
So do you think there are people a bit like people using mindfulness without really being committed to Buddhist ethics? There are people using Stoic techniques, as a kind of life hack, as a way to pursue conventional goals rather than radically different ethical goals.
That's exactly it. And that's the phrase. Sometimes people describe Stoicism as a life hack, because that's a popular phrase these days, but that kind of ruffles some of the community's feathers, because they think, well, Stoicism isn't a life hack, it's a philosophy of life. It's an ethic and a worldview. Like, it would be like calling Christianity a life hack or something, maybe in some sense you could be, but it seems odd to describe it, to frame it that way. It's like you're just kind of like taking a bit of it and not really embracing the thing.
And why not just use CBT in that case? Because that is still about the ethics, I guess.
Yeah. I guess if you take a lot of the stuff out of your life, just something that's closer to CBT or CBT-based self-help.
So but it is the data does seem to suggest that modern Stoicism is more popular with men than women.
But I've got a way of disputing that.
Okay.
All right, because you're right. I think it's like roughly 2/3 of the people that participate in the group and do Stoic Week online tend to be men, although I think in one instance, one of the times we ran Stoic Week, it was closer to 50-50 for some reason. But generally, it's about 2/3 men. But there's predominantly men study philosophy at university. If I remember right, I looked at some statistics on that a while ago, and so there's a similar kind of gender disparity among philosophy students in general. And also in the Epicurean group, I asked them about this once, and they told me they had a similar gender split. So I wonder if it is really reflective of Stoicism per se, or if it's simply a reflection of a broader gender disparity in studying classical philosophy.
Well, I certainly in churches are more women than men on the whole. And I'd be interested to know in Western Buddhism whether it's more women than men. Certainly when I go well, never mind yoga's way more women than men. But Buddhism, when I go to a Buddhist retreat, usually it's more women than men.
Right.
And it's certainly in psychology, like A-level and at university, it's more women than men. Is that a problem to your mind, or is that a good thing insofar as this is a way to get techniques and ideas for emotional health to men who would probably be turned off by psychotherapy or so on? Is it an issue for you?
Well, that's the thing. It is true. There's a couple of points that emerge from what you've just said. One is that Stoicism does provide a way of getting therapy techniques to men that would be turned off by the whole concept of counselling or therapy. That's certainly the case. Is it a problem that there's a gender disparity? Well, I don't know. There's a part of me that thinks, well, it's just the way that it is, and there's another part of me that thinks if there was more input from women in the community, it might help to kind of make some of the discussions more balanced. I definitely have a sense that there is this emphasis on love and compassion and these kind of qualities in classical Stoicism that gets neglected often, like in the Broicism type stuff. There's not much mention of that. Whereas if you look at the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, I often point this out to people. If you just flick through it, on virtually every page, he talks about love, compassion, the brotherhood of man, not being alienated from the rest of mankind, in social virtues and stuff. And this whole social and relationship dimension of Stoicism is often neglected in modern accounts, like completely absent from some of the books on the subject. And I kind of feel that if women engaged more, then they might, bring out some of that dimension of it a little bit more. And or if it's predominantly men, for some reason, I feel that they're more inclined to neglect that side.
So obviously Stoicism flourished online, and you run one of the biggest Facebook group, and they're also like, I guess, there's a Reddit page, there's a lot of blogs now, YouTube videos, podcasts, ebooks. So what and how? I mean, what's your sense of those online Stoic communities, and what are they like as cultures? I went on the other day to promote one of my talks, and I got ticked off for having criticised Stoicism in one of my talks. But that was the first time I've been on there for a while. What are they like as places? Are they places that where people support each other, or they kind of are disclosing stuff, or are they places more where people go for like intellectual discussion, or how would you characterize like your Facebook group, for example?
Well, the first thing I'd say is like I have a very different perspective on it. There's a reason why I perceive it differently from many of the people that go into the group, and it has to do with the way Facebook works, right? So there are between 500 to 1,000 posts in my group every month. So there's a lot of content there. And sometimes I'll get people who go on and say, this group is just full of people arguing about veganism. Or they'll say, this group is just dominated by liberals, or this group is dominated by the alt-right, or this group is dominated by people that are just into academic stuff. But I think there's 1,000 posts a month. And it's very diverse. So there are people just sharing their own personal struggles and discussing those. There are people arguing fine technical points in classical philosophy. And, there are people from all ends of the political spectrum debating it. But people viewing it will only see a tiny percentage of the total number of posts normally. Yeah. And I think it's the ones that they react to and comment on, they're probably more likely to see more similar posts or posts from the same author or so on. So they get a kind of, you can see that they get a very biased perception, and they assume that that's representative of the whole group usually. And I have to kind of point out to them, no, that's just the bits that you're interacting with. Right. You think it's all dominated by theology or dominated by libertarians or whatever, but it just so happens that that's 1% of the content that you're engaging with. And Facebook's showing you more of it. So my perspective as moderator, I see a much broader spectrum, and what I see is a very diverse range of interests among the people that are in the group.
And you also do a Stoic course online. Do you do that just during Stoic week, or do you do that all the time?
I have a course on Marcus Aurelius that I run like maybe 2 or 3 times a year, and also have a course about Socrates that runs a couple of times a year. And
do you still? I mean, when I was working in modern Stoicism, you would just give this away for free. Are you still doing that, or I hope you're charging?
No, I charge for the courses that I run on my own website, and then we have Stoic Week is free, and also we have a bigger course that Modern Stoicism runs called Stoic Mindfulness and Resilience Training. It's a 4-week skills-based training that's also free, and we use that to gather. It's like a slightly more controlled experiment, as it were, and we use that to gather data on the benefits of using Stoicism, psychological benefits.
Right. And do you get a good...
So the Modern Stoicism courses are free, and then my own courses I charge for.
And do you get a good sign-up for the ones you're charging for?
Do I get a good...
do you get a good sign up for them? Have they proven to be popular? The courses that you're the paid courses.
Yeah, they've been pretty popular so far, especially when I first launched them. I was surprised. I think The number of people that enrolled in the Marcus Aurelius course the first time I ran it was about 4 times what I anticipated. So obviously the numbers are smaller for paid courses, but like I was pretty impressed with the number of people that signed up for it. And each time I rerun the courses, more people enroll and do them. So that's becoming a thing, an ongoing thing.
Have you seen the appearance of, or do you want to yourself develop like new Stoic tech? Like I haven't really seen yet a kind of Stoic headspace, for example. There was talk of this kind of, was it called pocket Stoicism or something, but it didn't really happen.
Yeah.
Do you see that, or is that something you want to work on?
I've seen people developing. I've talked to people about apps being developed, and there are a bunch of apps that are out there. I've not been so involved with that, but I mean, there are already a couple of apps available, and I think that there are bound to be more that develop over time. But it's not an area that I've been doing a lot of work in. I've kind of collaborated a little bit with app developers, but not so much. I tend to stick with the blog and the web-based e-learning and stuff side. But what I have been developing recently is, in terms of the content, e-learning courses that are more focused on specific applications of Stoicism. So before it was more, so recently I thought, well, I'll try a specific application. So I designed a short e-learning course about coping with chronic pain using Stoicism.
Oh, right.
I put that together. I created an audio recording that people could listen to that would train them in psychological skills based on Stoicism, and we put that up. I think about 400 people did the beta version, and I gathered a lot of feedback from them, and it was very positive. The satisfaction ratings were like 88 to 95% for different aspects of the thing. So overall, they seem to say this is viable.
Yeah.
We haven't tested we haven't done proper controlled experiments on it, but the initial beta test was just to go, is this viable? Like, do you guys see yourselves doing this? Like, do you think there's anything we need to prove about it? And the initial feedback was, oh, no, it's fine. Yeah, this is usable. Like, it seems to have potential. So the next step would be then to do a kind of clinical trial based on that.
And do you think there are other particular kinds of issues or disorders that Stoicism might be particularly useful for?
Yeah, I just wrote an article, I co-authored it with one of the editors of the Behaviour Therapist, which goes out to all the cognitive behavioural therapists in the States. And we wrote an article kind of talking about the relationship between Stoicism and CBT. Although this is something I talk about a lot and I've written about a lot, I tend to do it in a more kind of popular self-help way. So, this time I thought, no, I want to properly address professional psychotherapists and talk about it from a slightly more technical and academic point of view. So we put this article together and went out in one of the journals. And the conclusion that I argued for at the end of it was that Stoicism has particular potential, and non-psychotherapists tend not to think of this. But I argued that the real value of Stoicism is as a preventative training approach. So what we tend to call emotional resilience building in the psychology field. So the prevention is better than cure, right? And prevention of anxiety and depression be the holy grail of psychotherapy. So CBT is normally designed to treat, is remedial, it's therapeutic, it treats problems that have already developed. Whereas Stoicism, I think, has more potential as a preventative training approach.
Yeah, I agree. In the UK, there's been a lot of talk about putting more money into preventative mental health, but and like what's called Public Health England have talked about that. But you could definitely do courses in ancient Greek philosophy in kind of community groups and charities and so forth. I mean, I've done some of them, but I think there's still a bit of a lack of an evidence base for things like practical philosophy and but it's I guess it's hopefully there'll be more trials of this kind of stuff.
We're getting closer. I mean, we're kind of inching closer. We've got some psychologists involved from America that are working with Tim LeBon on. I mean, Tim's gathered huge volumes of data, but it's kind of pilot studies. Like we're doing like correlational studies. We've got a self-selecting sample, so we need to do more rigorously controlled studies. But with SMRT, with the slightly more like rigorous training we had, one of the things we did last time round was a 3-month follow-up to see, just as an initial pilot level, to see whether the results were sticky. And that's edging closer to, looking at the longer term benefits as a preventative approach. And what Tim found was really surprising, because normally you'd see a reduction in the improvements that people report at 3 months. That would be natural. So you're hoping to minimize the amount that those improvements are reduced by. And he saw virtually no change. So 3 months later, people were reporting the same level of improvement that they'd experienced immediately after the 4-week training. And that's very promising. It'd be interesting then to see at 6 months and at 1 year follow-up, is it still sticky? And what happens if we have a random sample of people that aren't self-selecting? Would they get the same benefit from it? And what happens if we then compare it against positive psychology-based or CBT-based resilience training? So those would be the next steps. I think we're getting closer to doing that, though.
I also feel excited about the potential for Stoicism in prisons.
Yeah.
There's just about 6 or 7 or maybe even like 10 people working independently around the world. Yeah. And they've all either consciously or just by accident come across the fact that Stoicism really resonates with people inmates, particularly male inmates.
Yeah.
And I just think there's huge potential, even just to put together like a kind of little book or pamphlet that's like very, very basic Stoic ideas with some of the kind of role models of people who practice this in prisons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's that book, The Epictetus Club, by a guy who works in prisons.
Yeah.
And the other kind of niche, we talked about the culture and stuff. It might be worth saying, I've noticed over the years that are these kind of subgenres or niches of different professional groups or types of people that get into Stoicism.
Yeah.
So there's the people working in prisons that get into it, and inmates that get into it. And then there's the military as well. There's a bunch of people that just independently around the world involved in the military. And again, there's that book by Nancy Sherman about Stoicism in the military. So that's like a little thing in its own as well. And then there's also sports coaches that get into Stoicism, as well as the psychotherapists that are into it, and the classicists and the philosophers that are into it. And then there's the kind of trainers and life coaches and the kind of like the people that work in the tech industry sort of niche. So within Stoicism, there's these kind of sub-communities.
There are, and comedians
that are into Stoicism as well. Yeah.
Aging comedians. After the laughter stops, they turn to Stoicism.
Yeah.
I know of quite a few comedians who like older comedians who've got into Stoicism, like Adrian Edmondson, Sale, John Lloyd. So there's that. Yeah, and I guess performers in a way, because you have performance anxiety. So I think sometimes performers of different types, whether that's sports or theatre or music, can use Stoicism to manage some of that performance anxiety.
Yeah, the Stoics talk about performance anxiety. Actually, Epictetus has got a discourse about it. And also, I mean, people...
he's got a discourse about playing ball, doesn't he?
Yeah. They talk about sports and stuff, about playing ball. And also comedy. There were Stoic satirists, Perseus, and, the Cynics were also known for writing satires. And Chrysippus apparently wrote a lot of jokes. And even according to one story, Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoa, and one of the most important Stoics in a way, supposedly died from laughing at one of his own jokes. Like that Monty Python sketch where they have the joke that's so funny that it, like, it's dangerous. Right. You know that one? Like, one of his own jokes killed him.
So, did he ever get to tell anyone else the joke, or?
Yeah, but it's kind of, like it's some sort of pun or something. I don't know.
It's lost in translation. Okay. Yeah. So do you get approached by people saying, would you be my Stoic mentor, or my, you know, would you give me or my organization Stoic coaching? Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes, but I haven't been doing a lot of that. Like, it's not, I kind of didn't have the time to do it because I've been a bit busy recently
Yeah.
doing everything else under the sun.
Right.
Kind of writing and doing e-learning and stuff. I've done a little bit of individual, like, Stoic life coaching and stuff.
Right.
And not so much with organizations, more with individuals. Like,
Yeah.
but most of what I've been doing has been writing and designing e-learning courses and running those recently.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And have you come across any celebrity Stoics?
Celebrity Stoics, like, there are a few, aren't there? Like, yeah, I'm not really super up to speed on that, but
you've had no kind of limousines pulling up in front of your house and
people that want to it's like famous Stoics. Like, I was talking recently to those Karen Duffy in the States, used to be an MTV presenter, and she was in some movies, and
right.
she's in Dumb and Dumber, and she was like a Revlon model and stuff. And she wrote a book about coping with chronic pain called Backbone, how to living with chronic pain without becoming one, I think is the subtitle. And it's got a lot of stuff in it about Stoicism. So she's kind of on TV and stuff, and she's been in movies and things, and she's into Stoicism. And then, like you say, in Britain there seem to be a bunch of people. Darren Brown's into Stoicism. And you know, like, there's like a bunch of other people on TV that get into it. He wrote about Stoicism in his book Happy. Have you read that book?
Not yet.
It's really good, actually. I've read a lot of books recently. I had to review loads of these books, and that's probably my favourite out of all the books I've read over the past year.
Okay, so you've warmed to Darren Brown, have you?
Yeah, I mean, I really, like, I enjoyed that book. I wasn't super into all the kind of, like, I said in my review, and I think I've said to him, like, I hate magic, like, and illusionists and stuff. Like, it's for all sorts of reasons that I don't have any truck with it. But I read his book, and he's actually a surprisingly good writer.
Yeah.
And I say that because I've read so many self-help books today and like recently, and you know, the quality of writing and the thoughtfulness in his book was a level like beyond.
He's pretty erudite, isn't he? I mean, he's kind of
he is very erudite, yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's a chunk about Stoicism in there that was kind of interesting. And then I read Nassim Taleb's book Anti-Fragile, which has a chapter on Stoicism, and like, but you know, that was just terrible and like really unreflective and had loads of mistakes in it, and like it was. And he seems not good at all. Like,
yeah, he seems pretty pompous. For someone talking about anti-fragility, he seems to have a very inflated
fragile ego. Yeah, like,
is that harsh? Yeah, that's just how it comes across. But I don't know.
I think that a lot of people say that, right? He's always arguing with people on Twitter.
Serious big head. Yeah.
Yeah, but the chapter he wrote on Stoicism has a bunch of mistakes in it. Like just, it's odd. He says something in that book about how he doesn't like using copy editors or proofreaders, and so he doesn't actually say whether his manuscript was edited or whatever, but it kind of looks like it wasn't, because I would have thought an editor would have spotted some of the things that he, like historical inaccuracies, and like he talks about Seneca's Fortune, which he quotes from Cassia's Dio, but he gets the denomination wrong. Like, it's just like a almost like a typo or something, and other like weird little inaccuracies.
Why didn't you tell him on Twitter?
I did. I reviewed it, and he said he read my review, but he was very happy about it. I think he probably called me an idiot or something like that. Like he does with everybody. He gets that trashed a bit. Like he said that Seneca is a child of the Italian peninsula. He says, and I was like, Seneca was born in Spain. Yeah. Like, everyone knows that Seneca was born in Spain, right? And I said that to him, and he said something kind of cryptic about, "Oh, that's not what he meant." But I was like, "What did you mean? Like, in what sense is he a child of the Italian peninsula?" Like, but yeah. Anyway, so I wasn't super impressed with that account of Stoicism.
Okay.
But Darren Brown's book was much more reflective.
Yeah, that's good. Do you think that modern Stoicism and the revival of Stoicism has influenced, academia much, academic philosophy, classicism, or just general, like, you know, the idea of what the point of a university is and what university education can do. Do you see that?
I'm not sure how much, if I could kind of quantify that, but definitely, I mean, I see a little bit. We have these academics that come to the conference and stuff, right? And like, you know,
do they come initially scornful and then kind of warm up to it?
I think so. Or some of them seem quite just taken aback. You know,
because they're used to speaking to, like, you know, 8 people in a lunchtime.
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah. So I think some of them are like, well, yeah, we're used to speaking to smaller groups of people, not like 400. We had 400 people at the Toronto conference, and so for them, I think some of them were just like, oh, there's this many people that are interested in Stoicism, and we're like, no, like there's loads more, or like it's a huge thing. They're not really exposed to that audience. So I think it's a little bit of a surprise for them in a way that there's that level of interest. And you know, maybe they're a little bit scornful at first, but generally, you know, once they come along to the conference and stuff and they see there's other academics speaking and things, that you know, they warm up to it.
And I wonder if I just, you know, I mean, I do I've started to do a course for undergraduates on a kind of interdisciplinary course at my university on, like, well-being, and that includes like a lecture on Stoicism and Cbt. And just to bring in some of that kind of practical wisdom into, you know, into universities, which I think American universities, you know, they may be a bit better at doing than British ones. You know, they sometimes have these introductory courses, and they might include some great books in that. You know, like Jonathan Haidt did his course on flourishing and maybe had a bit on the Stoics and so on. So that's something I would love to see. Yeah, you know, just like really basic stuff that can be very useful for whatever you're majoring in.
And traditionally, Stoicism isn't really taught at all in most undergraduate philosophy curricula.
No.
You know, I didn't study the Stoics when I studied philosophy at Aberdeen. It wasn't until I finished my philosophy degree that I came across them. So it's odd. But I think maybe I think that's changing, but it's changing very slowly. And, I mean, the other thing that I find odd as well, I should say, is, you know, we sort of forget about this sometimes. So there's this big connection between Stoicism and CBT. And like everybody seems to be aware of that now, that's into Stoicism. It's generally understood. But still, you know, even a decade or more, like I've been giving talks on Stoicism and writing articles about it for like at least 15 years, probably maybe a bit more than that now. But like the psychotherapists still haven't really kind of like latched onto it, you know, like there's not a kind of Stoicism movement within psychotherapy or CBT, which kind of surprises me. You know, I think
because there is a Buddhist movement, isn't there?
But they haven't, and so, like you say, independently, a lot of psychotherapists discover Stoicism, but they haven't kind of collectively started to embrace it. And so I was trying to actually give that a nudge by publishing that article on the behaviour therapist to see if I could prompt them a little bit more to realise it was worth engaging with at a different level, a deeper level. So that surprises me a little bit. I kind of thought the CBT practitioners would have jumped on it a little bit more, because everyone else, or the clients, seem to see the connection.
So tell me about the new book. So it's called, what's the full title? It's called How to Think Like an Emperor.
How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius.
Right.
So the main title was a little bit cryptic, but I was clarifying the subtitle that we're not talking about Caligula or Nero or whatever. So we're talking about the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. And I mean, so I was asked to write a book about, or it was suggested that I write another book about Stoicism. And I thought, well, I've already written a couple of books about Stoicism. And I wrote a teach yourself book, Stoicism and the Art of Happiness. It's like a basic self-help introduction. And it's just gone into its second revised edition, actually. And I'm about to also do a revised edition of my first book on Stoicism, The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioural Therapy. So both those books have been popular enough that they're being published in second editions, like with a lot of revisions. It was suggested I write another book about Stoicism, and I thought, well, I can't do another beginner's guide to Stoicism because I've done that already. And also there are loads of those now, like a bunch of other people have written kind of introductions and beginner's guides to Stoicism. So I thought, well, I want to write something that's going to be accessible to a wider audience, but I don't want to just kind of, reinvent the wheel. And I thought about it, and how could I approach it from a different perspective? And the thing that really inspired me was I have a 7-year-old daughter called Poppy, and she loves Greek mythology. So I told her lots of stories about Greek mythology. And when I ran out of stories about Greek mythology, I started to tell her stories about Greek philosophy. So she really loves stories about Socrates and Diogenes and Seneca and stuff. And I realized that, in the ancient world, philosophy was taught not just through dialogues and lectures, but through lots of little anecdotes and stories, and some of them come from satires, like I mentioned earlier. So we have a collection of those in Diogenes Laertius, the Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers. We have an entire book that's full of all these little anecdotes and stories about philosophers and their lives, and many of them kind of communicate important philosophical points, practical wisdom and stuff. And as I was telling Poppy these little stories and getting her to think about life and stuff, through these anecdotes, I thought that this is another way of teaching philosophy, and in many ways it's a more accessible way of teaching philosophy. There's a longer tradition, but there's not much literature like that about classical philosophy today. And so I thought, well, also the Stoics seem to me to have thought that learning from role models and learning by looking at examples of real people is a better way to learn Stoicism than just through lectures. They seem pretty clear about that, and they talk about it in various places. And you see in Epictetus, he's often referring to Diogenes and Socrates as role models, and also people that he knew personally. There's a guy called Paconius Agrippinus, who was a member of the Stoic opposition, that Epictetus talks about as this kind of role model and what we can learn from him. So I thought maybe I can write a beginner's guide to Stoicism that approaches it in terms of telling these stories about historical figures that were Stoics. And I thought, well, the Stoic that we know most about is the last famous Stoic.
Yeah.
And actually, after Marcus Aurelius, we hear virtually nothing about any other Stoics, strangely.
I mean, unless you count Boethius as a Stoic, I guess.
Unless well, yeah. I don't know if I'd count him as a Stoic, but Stoic influenced, maybe.
Yeah.
But Marcus Aurelius, we know quite a lot about. In fact, people that are into the meditations usually don't realize how much we know about his life, because we have several Roman histories that describe his character and his reign, and contain a bunch of anecdotes about him. They often have some philosophical significance. And so I thought, well, we can write about Marcus Aurelius, and he's the most popular Stoic. More people have read the Meditations than have read Seneca or Epictetus. And I thought, well, let's write about his life, and I'll try and make it so that each chapter of the book tells a story about his life and then links it to the philosophy, and then I'll link that to cognitive behavioral therapy or modern psychological self-help approaches that people can actually apply. And each chapter deals with a different issue, like coping with anger, managing unruly desires and overcoming bad habits, coping with pain and illness, dealing with anger,
dealing with barbarians,
dealing with putting down barbarian uprisings.
Goths.
There's a chapter about that. Like, there's a lot of stuff with the plague. There's a lot of stuff at coping with the plague. Yeah.
So what were some of the kind of episodes from his life which you think show that he was a wise person as well as a good writer?
There's a bunch of interesting things. There's an anecdote about the Civil War. So there was a civil war during his reign, and there was the most powerful general in the Roman army was a guy called Avidius Cassius, and he was stationed in the east while Marcus was fighting a protracted war at the other side of the empire and the northern frontier. And Avidius Cassius became more and more powerful until eventually he was kind of vying with Marcus Aurelius, and he had himself declared emperor. So this kind of instigated the civil war. We don't really know much about, even if there were many actual battles, there must have been some, but we don't hear a lot about them. But it didn't last very long anyway. So Cassius was much more hawkish than Marcus. Marcus had I think he was frustrated that the war on the northern frontier was taking so long, but that was partly because Marcus was trying to negotiate a lot between the various tribes, and there was a lot of complicated political negotiations that had to take place. And Marcus was more of a dove. He was thinking more about the long-term welfare of the empire, whereas Cassius, I think, just wanted to go up there and kill everybody and get it over with. But so there was this civil war, and there's a speech that Cassius Dio reports Marcus giving, and it's kind of amazing. We don't know for sure how authentic this speech is, but if there's any grain of truth in it, like what Marcus does is that he announces that he's going to pardon everybody that's involved in this, which is a really striking thing to do. And again, we can see that as, you know, the Stoics were against revenge. Like in the Meditations, he talks a lot about forgiveness and understanding even your enemies.
Yeah.
Right? So in this speech, he seems to be acting in that way, and he says, "I'm going to pardon everybody that's involved in this," and I assume that it's based on some kind of misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Now, ironically, that ended the war because Marcus actually had a superior army to Avidius Cassius. His rebellion didn't spread to the other provinces because they remained loyal to Marcus. And where Cassius kind of used brutality and force to discipline his troops, Marcus was more benevolent and earned the trust and loyalty of his troops over time. So the other eastern provinces remained loyal to Marcus, even though he was far away. But ironically, Cassius's men thought, well, there's a good chance we're all going to die in this war. Like, Marcus has got a stronger army, and we're going to get pardoned anyway, right? Like, so two of his officers assassinated him. They chopped his head off, and
assassinated Avidius
Cassius. Like, 3 months into the rebellion, they were like, "There's no point fighting this. We're all going to get pardoned anyway." Like, and so Marcus was as good as his word, and he forgave everybody, and that was the end of it. Like, and he actually, the story goes that not only did he do that, but he actually protected Cassius's wife and children from persecution following the war. But then after Marcus died, Commodus, who wasn't a Stoic, had them hunted down and burned alive as traitors.
So it's not just a Hollywood myth that Commodus, was not a very philosophical. That Marcus Aurelius' son Commodus was a bit of a wrong un.
Yeah, he wasn't. There's different accounts of it. I mean, according to one of the, I mean, we also have to take these histories with a little bit of a pinch of salt, so it's hard to say how reliable they are. But according to one, and they seem very negative about Commodus, like it seems like exaggeration maybe. But according to one account anyway, he was more just gullible and easily swayed, and he was kind of manipulated by the circle of people that surrounded him.
Right.
But shortly after Marcus died, he abandoned the northern frontier. They paid big bribes to the barbarian kings in order to settle, and then he was desperate to return to Rome, and it was partly because he wanted to avoid the plague, perhaps, which was more of a risk in the legionary camps, because when people were camped close together, there were more risk of contracting the plague or other illnesses. So he went back to Rome, but that meant that he no longer really, a Roman emperor has to maintain his status by getting the support of the Senate, the support of the army, and Commodus kind of blew that. So the other way that you maintain your status as emperor is getting the support of the populace at Rome, and the way you do that is by throwing lots of events and festivals, and so
like the film, he really was fond of kind of gladiatorial contests.
Yeah, and he turned himself, actually ironic, kind of relevant today in a way. He became more like a celebrity. So you could say he's trying to develop it, and there's all these statues of him dressed in a lion headdress like Hercules. So he's trying to kind of deify himself, mythologize himself, turn himself into this celebrity in order to maintain his status, because he'd blown his reputation with the army.
Interesting. So I guess one of the things that surprised me about Marcus Aurelius is there he is, maybe the most powerful man in the world, and a great Stoic philosopher. And I guess he was in a position where he could have tried to kind of spread Stoicism to the masses in the way that the Emperor Julian tries to spread Neoplatonism. But he doesn't, does he? Marcus says something like, there's some quote which you all know better than me about, you can't force Stoicism onto people. All you get is grudging or feigned assent. That that you can't really impose philosophy on the masses from above. But I mean,
this is kind of like the Stoic idea that we need to lead by example, though, rather than lecturing people.
Right. Okay. So I mean, am I right in thinking that he didn't really try to kind of promote Stoicism to the empire? He was never a philosopher king, like a kind of Platonic figure.
I think this is ambiguous. Actually, it's kind of hard to tell. Like, probably not. But the Historia Augusta says that he read from a book of philosophical aphorisms that he'd written at Rome. So it's not clear if that's the Meditations or somehow related to it, or if it's another text.
He would read this out.
He gave some kind of public reading from his philosophical writings. It alleges, and then there's also a number of other accounts about how there were lots of philosophers attracted to Rome at that time, and several eminent teachers. So, like, a lot of people jumped on the bandwagon, as it were, because they all knew that he was. There's no question that everybody knew that Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic, and so Stoicism did kind of become trendy at the time, like during his reign. And there were other powerful Stoics that were part of his like the ruling classes at that time as well. But we don't know that much more about it. It doesn't seem like he made a real effort to directly convert people, but he was also kind of busy fighting wars and stuff. Like, he didn't have that much time to go about doing that. But there were a lot of Stoic philosophers around at the time.
And what do you think is one of his most useful practical ideas for us today?
There are so many. Actually, the first book that I wrote, I went back and looked at it recently, like the different Stoic psychological strategies that I'd identified when I was kind of reviewing them, and there were, to see how many there were, and there were about 18, sort of depending on how you carve it up. So there are a whole bunch of things that we can potentially learn from Marcus, but I think one of the most useful things is the view from above, like and, this idea of viewing things within a broader context, and
which is what, for someone who hasn't heard of that, give me a brief kind of description of that practice.
Well, I'll tell you something really cool about it. Right? So there are several passages in Marcus where he says. He attributes this to Plato. Actually, he says Plato says we should survey events as if viewing them from some high watchtower, and he talks about viewing like people in law courts and traders and fighting battles and picturing all the events in the world from high above. And we have a number of very similar accounts of this kind of perspective or psychological exercise in other philosophical traditions as well, not just in the Stoics. Like Cicero, for example, there's a famous passage called the Dream of Scipio, where a Roman general's portrayed having a dream where he views Carthage and Rome fighting each other from really high above to get a kind of detached perspective and look at the bigger picture. But I'll tell you something interesting I noticed when I went to Athens recently. It struck me, this should be obvious, but it wasn't until I actually went there. In the middle of Athens, there's the Acropolis, which literally just means high up part of the city. So there's a hill in the middle of the city that had temples and stuff on it. And so all the Athenians would be familiar with that. And when you go up there, you're looking down on Athens, and in particular, you have a view of the Agora, where the political assemblies took place, and people traded, and there were shops and market stalls and stuff. So all this stuff that Marcus Aurelius describes there, like, is pretty much what you'd see looking down from the temples and stuff on the Acropolis. Yeah. And I wonder if the Greek philosophers that were kind of influenced by that, they must have been familiar with looking down on the Agora like that. And
that's interesting. There's in the Clouds by Aristophanes, you have
that's right.
Up in the cloud, don't you? When he comes on stage, and I wonder, do you think, what is your thought on the idea, the fact that philosophers like Marcus were all initiated at the mysteries? So Marcus was initiated into the mysteries of Eleusis, and also the Mithraic mysteries. It's hard to tell, isn't it, how that might have, first of all, what happened at these mysteries and how it influenced, philosophy. We know that Cicero said the Eleusinian mysteries are the greatest gift of Greek civilization. And that something pretty powerful went on. And there, there is the theory. I personally am open to it. I guess I'm even sympathetic to it. That this was some kind of psychedelic initiation that they went through, and maybe this influence. There is one book I read which suggested this influenced the Stoic idea of the interconnectedness of all things. That rather mystical vision of the logos, of the universe being one breathing, animate web, which Marcus describes so beautifully. Do you have a theory? I mean, what's your thought? I suppose it's just hard to know, isn't it?
Well, that's the problem, is that they were secretive, so we know very little about them. But I mean, and we don't know for sure that Marcus was initiated into Mithraism. But I wrote an article about this where I argued I think he probably was, because Antoninus Pius, his adoptive father, the emperor that preceded him, and also Commodus, his son, both seem to have been initiated into the cult of Mithras. So it seems very likely that Marcus would have been as well, because where he stationed himself for most of the war in Carnuntum, we know from archaeological finds that there are the largest concentration in the world of Mithraic shrines there. And one of the things that's distinctive about them, they have these buildings that were, the ceiling and the walls were painted with astrological signs and stars. So they're meant to resemble the night sky. And there are these passages in Marcus Aurelius where he says, imagine yourself among the stars, like kind of when he's talking about things related to the view from above. And so it's easy to imagine that those passages are inspired by, being in those Mithraic temples.
And the practice of the view from above, of kind of detaching and seeing things from as if from space or from a great height, why is that therapeutic for people?
I think for a number of reasons. One is that we know when people experience strong emotions, like recently there's been a lot of interest in the fact that in the way it affects their allocation of attention. So when people are distressed, particularly when they're anxious, they tend to narrow the scope of attention and focus more on perceived threats. And we know that when people broaden their scope of attention, when they're thinking about taking in several things at once, that it kind of dilutes their feelings. So they're exposing themselves to more stimuli at once. Whereas when you narrow your attention down, you're ignoring everything else and just focusing on the scary thing, like you're putting it under a magnifying glass, as it were. So the view from above massively expands our perception. So we can still think about a bad thing that's happened, but we're taking in a bunch of other things at the same time, which has a kind of diluting effect, as well as placing things in a broader context. So people also tend to freeze images in time at the worst point. So they think about something bad that will happen, but they tend not to think about how they would recover from it in the days and weeks that follow. And when they broaden their temporal perspective as well, it usually dilutes the feelings of distress that they experience.
Which is something Marcus does a lot, isn't he? He talks about like the river of time, imagining and a lot of kind of mortality meditations, no?
Yeah.
And tell me a bit about some of them and why they're helpful, like as Marcus practices.
The phone. I mean, the Stoics and other philosophical schools in the ancient world were into this idea of contemplating our own mortality. And, Marcus believed that it has a number of benefits. And one of them is that, if we remind ourselves that we're all going to die one day, that death is certain, then he believed that it prevents us from becoming too puffed up, from placing too much importance on certain things in life. It allows us to kind of keep things in perspective more. And it also encourages us to be more grateful for the present moment, and to experience a greater appreciation of life, and in particular of the here and now.
Now, Marcus would have, and other Stoics, would they have believed in an afterlife?
No, the Stoics generally didn't believe in an afterlife, and that's partly because they were kind of quasi-materialists. So they rejected the Platonic idea of a kind of metaphysical heaven of pure forms, or any kind of world behind the scenes, as Nietzsche calls it. Like they thought that God So although they believed in God, they were pantheists. So they believed that God was immanent in the universe, and he was really the mind of the cosmos as a whole. So there isn't anywhere else to go, as it were. Like there's not another.
So the bit of the logos that's within you will go back to the big logos.
Yeah.
Personality won't survive.
That's what they tend to say, is that when we die, we're returned to nature.
Right.
But there's not. Although some Stoics may have disagreed about this. I mean, Stoicism lasted 500 years, and we know that they did disagree about some theological points. So I think there's some indication that some of them might believe that souls endured for a while after death, but generally they don't seem to have put much credence in the idea of an afterlife.
Okay, so just finally, Don, how would you say that Stoicism has changed you in the kind of 15, 20 years that you've been engaged with it? And how would you say that your Stoicism has changed over that time?
Well, gosh, I mean, I think my appreciation of Stoicism has changed a lot over that period of time. And I guess in lots of ways, many kind of nuanced ways, you know, more recently, like I mentioned earlier, I suppose I've become more interested in what Stoicism says about friendship and relationships and love and stuff like that. You know, the kind of interpersonal aspect of Stoicism has become more important to me. And also I see the Stoics more now as very much Socratics. And, you know, I see far more overlap between the philosophy of Socrates and Stoicism than I did before. And so that adds a kind of another dimension to my appreciation of them. And again, I see this.
What does that mean, that you're enjoying the kind of Platonic dialogues and so forth?
Yeah, and Xenophon, I'm kind of perhaps even more interested in the memorabilia of Xenophon and his other dialogues as well, and the other bits and pieces. We know a lot about Socrates from other sources like Diogenes Laertius as well. Yeah. So yeah, that kind of, because the thing about Plato is it was understood even in the ancient world that Plato's writings kind of evolved over time, and that the earlier Platonic dialogues seem to be more representative of a simpler philosophy that was probably professed by Socrates. And then the middle and the later dialogues have the theory of forms and perhaps also political theories that seem unlikely to have come from Socrates. And are perhaps influenced by Pythagoreanism, like in Plato's own perspective.
So you're into the kind of Socratic and Xenophon, and more of an interesting emphasis on like the relational and I guess effective with an A, Stoicism in some ways.
Yeah. And then the psychological,
and a more emotional Stoicism, like positive emotions. Social emotions.
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, the neglect of the interpersonal side of Stoicism, it goes hand in hand with people kind of thinking that Stoics are unemotional, you know, because the most important emotional component of Stoicism is natural affection, philostorgia, like having a kind of compassion, a kindness and affection towards other people, and in fact trying to kind of extend that even to strangers. And you know,
do you think that the modern Stoic can usefully draw on other wisdom traditions, and is that something you do?
Yeah. I mean, most of my time is spent studying Stoicism, so I don't have much time to kind of read other stuff now. But when I was younger, I read very widely. You know, at university, I studied history of Indian religions as part of my philosophy course. So I studied the Bhagavad Gita in depth, and the Tao Te Ching, and you know, the Upanishads, and you know, lots of kind of, even a lot of New Age and kind of occult literature, and you know, other aspects of Western philosophy as well. And so all of these things have influenced me over the years. You know, I'm not so much engaged with them now, although I see people that are interested in Stoicism often drawing parallels with Buddhism, for example. And sometimes other, like, you know, existentialism as well. Sometimes they'll connect it with, or, you know, other philosophical spiritual traditions, definitely.
And have you considered for your next project following up on your stories for Poppy and doing a kind of philosophical stories for children?
I proposed that a while ago, but I can tell you what I'm doing next. Like, I'm 99% sure that very soon we're going to proceed with a graphic novel that's about Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism. So it's kind of similar to this book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, but it'll be a graphic novel. So I've done 3 web comics that are like little samples of that.
Cool.
We're kind of almost certainly going to proceed with that next. And then after that, further down the line, this is more contentious, but I'd like to write a book called The Female Socrates, and that's about
Hypatia or
about actually it's a little bit complicated, but it's about what Socrates says about love, relationships, and friendship, and so on, and how that influenced what the Stoics say. But Socrates tends to attribute those aspects of his philosophy to several women, including his mother, Phaenarete, who was a midwife, to Diotima, this priestess in the Symposium, who some people believe we know nothing else about her, but people think she sounds a lot like Aspasia, the courtesan lover of Pericles, who Socrates allegedly was friends with and learned from. And then there's a couple of other women that there's a courtesan called Theodota that he has a dialogue with about love and friendship in the Memorabilia. So it seems like there's kind of several women that he talks about learning this stuff from. On the other one would be the Pythia, the oracle at Delphi, also had an important influence on Socrates, and kind of in a way started his philosophical career by this pronouncement that no one was wiser than him. In Plato's Apology, he tells that story, and he says this is really what started my
the hidden women of Greek philosophy.
Yeah, these women that are kind of in sidelines, but Socrates, if you look closely at Socrates, he really attributes a lot of importance to the influence that they had on him.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Don, it was a pleasure to catch up with you.
Nice to speak to you again.
Nice to speak to you, and good luck with the book, which comes out, like you say, first week of April or so.
2nd of April.
2nd of April. Brilliant. Well, good luck with that, and thank you for all the work you do and all the stuff you do, basically for free as well, for the Stoic community. I'm sure it's appreciated by a lot of people.
Awesome. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for interviewing me, Jules. It's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you, and I hope to catch up with you in offline as well, like maybe at the Stoicon or whatever. But before too long, I hope.
Yeah. Well, the next one's going to be in Athens, so maybe an opportunity.
Is it?
For
cool.
to yeah.